Hi everyone, welcome to the third lecture of Module 2. So today we will talk about reuse and preservation in architecture, two topics that are among the most relevant to contemporary design. The goal of this lecture is to allow you to gain as much knowledge as possible in order to become critical about issues such as transformation, adaptive reuse, and sustainability in architecture. Here is the outline of today's lecture. First, we look at theory with an introduction to the topic. We will look at the notion of renewal and integration between old and new, and discuss it through many different references. In the second part, instead, we explore the topic in practice by looking in detail at three case studies. There will be a break in between the two parts, but please feel free to take extra breaks if it helps you to absorb the information better. We start the lecture by looking at a manifesto for preservation, which was recently published in the text by Rem Koolhaas together with Jorge Otero Palacios. In architecture history, the format of the manifesto as a public declaration of intentions often helped architects to announce major turning points in the profession. Is preservation today's avant-garde, or in Rem Koolhaas's words, is it overtaking us? With this manifesto, Koolhaas argues that the future of architecture is led by preservation. Let's look at its first point. We can see how the foundations of his argument are in describing a shift in what progress in architecture stands for today. Koolhaas states that the problem at the base of this change is that star architecture and design, driven by capitalism, led to an environment of excess which only helped to produce a superficial idea of innovation. Until recently, authorship and new forms were associated with advance in the field. The manifesto argues that these issues today appear superficial when compared to some of the current challenges which architecture needs to face. Issues such as the environmental, economic crisis, or decolonization, which was explained by Shakira a couple of weeks ago. Through this manifesto, Koolhaas argues that actions of preservation in architecture should be proactive instead of retrospective. In other words, architects shouldn't approach the past in a nostalgic way, trying to freeze it, but instead they should find new ways to advance with what exists already. In terms of design, this relates to what he describes as a formless architecture, ways in which architects can transform and adapt existing structures, extending their lives for a future use. The environmental crisis is the first reason that comes to mind when thinking about why reuse and preservation should be at the front of the profession today. In this slide, we can see how preservation starts to be applied through policy making at an urban scale. This slide shows part of a plan published by the Mayor of London in 2019, which seeks to support organizations in the construction industry move to more sustainable practices. One of the points highlighted here is how this plan encourages practices of reuse, as they can help to reduce the demand for new materials and waste. The effects of development and economic growth led to the production of waste in all fields, with the construction industry being one of its major contributors. In this report, it is estimated that only in London, the sector consumes 400 million tons of material each year and accounts for 54% of total waste. Information that tells us why suddenly the attention turns to architecture in order to question and rethink ways in which we build today. From the more obvious environmental claim, another argument for the importance of reuse and preservation is that from generic, architecture becomes highly site-specific. We might understand this point as a different idea of sustainability, one that comes from a close connection between old and new. Urban regeneration is often a top-down strategy which leads to the demolition of entire areas with little concern for what gets torn down. Preservation instead challenges architects to think of alternative forms of urban renewal, starting from the concept of tabula plana. You can find the definition of tabula plana in this slide together with other words that are used in the lecture so that you can go back to it in the PDF. Basically, what this term means is the opposite concept to tabula rasa. And architects, instead of starting from a clean slate, they have instead to find ways of working within a space that is already filled with existing buildings and systems that have accumulated over time. As architects engage with existing conditions, projects of alteration challenge a collective approach to design. Firstly, in the way architects are invited to develop projects in response to previous architects' decisions. The single author somehow becomes less important as architecture is transformed by different ones. In architecture, this is sometimes described as a palimpsest, and again, a term that I've noted in this slide, and that refers to something that is constantly reused or altered over time, and where often traces of the past are still visible. So what if every existing building had to be preserved, adapted and reused, and new buildings could only use materials that were already available? Could we continue to make and remake our cities out of what is already there? This project by Simon Starling is called Shed Boat Shed, and it involved the movement of a found structure, an old wooden shed from one riverside location to the other. The journey was achieved through the temporary transformation of the shed into a boat. In a similar way, we might think of architecture as something that is neither created nor destroyed, but that is instead constantly reorganized and transformed within space. This is certainly not a contemporary idea, although it appears as if it has lost itself in time. Examples of reuse in architecture can be found appearing as early as the 1st century AD with the ancient tradition of spolia. The term comes from the Latin word spoliare, to strip off, and it describes a practice based on the reuse of stone architectural fragments, which were carried away from their original context and incorporated in new constructions. This tradition became widespread in late antiquity, especially in Rome, when with the decline of the empire, materials started to be removed from ruins and used in new constructions. For instance, the Basilica of Santa Sabina on the top right, which was built in the 4th century using 24 columns which were taken from the Roman Forum. Another famous example that shows the practice of spolia is in Spain and can be found in the Mosque of Cordoba, which is known for its 856 recycled columns, which were salvaged from a nearby Roman temple. Here instead we look at a different example that points out the practice of recycling and transforming architecture continued throughout history, not just at the scale of fragments, but also of entire structures. The Mausoleum of Augustus is famous for its incredible history of transformations, which still continues today. The circular brick structure counts 8 major changes over a time span of 2,000 years. It was first built as a family tomb for the emperor's dynasty. It was later adapted as a garden, a theater hosting Spanish corridas, popular games and fireworks, a venue hosting a dinner party for the Italian unification, and finally, a permanent concert hall. The building was stripped off in the 1930s to reveal the archaeology beneath, and has since been left as a ruin in the center of Rome. Today, a new phase begins as the ruin is going to be restored and turned into a space for performances, showing how its use continues to change over time. The concept of preservation in architecture, instead, arrived much later in history. It was founded to provide a set of regulation that would protect buildings judged to be historically significant. Here are some key moments of when it was born, how it developed, and where it is leading today. From 1882, when the legislation only included religious buildings or ancient monuments, today it extends to landscapes, factories, shops. Basically, everything that we inhabit could be potentially subject to preservation. Also, when we look at the time span of how old a building needed to be in order to be considered heritage, we realize that in the 19th century, this started with 2000 years old, while today it could be applied to buildings that were built a few years ago. Since age is no longer a criteria, then, what is it that determines what stays and what goes? What are the rules of preservation today? Experimental preservation in architecture tests the potential of places to be recognized as heritage. For example, buildings or spaces that are generally considered waste, in order to test their capacity to transform them. This involves a process of back and forth between people and buildings, where an interest and concern for a particular space opens a debate to keep it. Another point which shows that preservation not only answers to environmental issues, but often also to cultural ones, as buildings are perceived as part of our collective memory and identity. The questions that arise from these are many. For instance, who regulates the process of giving historical and cultural significance? Is it possible as a society to go towards a more inclusive understanding of heritage and embracing different point of views? Or for instance, which objects should be discarded and which chosen? As preservation becomes an experimental practice, it hints to the risk of failure and success, sometimes proving to be a very controversial process. In this example, we see Robin Hood Gardens, a famous modernist housing estate located in East London and designed by Ellison and Peter Smithson in the 70s. In 2008, a new development threatened to replace the building. The event led to a widespread public support in order to save the building from demolition, with many architecture projects which propose alternatives to remodel the existing building. At last, the government refused to give it protection as a historic building. And just before it was taken down, the V&A Museum in London acquired a slice of the estate as a last chance to keep it as an artifact. This is another controversial case which followed a very similar fate. The Welbeck Street car park, designed by Michael Blampide, was completed in 1970 near Oxford Street. After various appeals to preserve it as a fine example of modernist architecture in London, the building again officially failed to be listed as heritage. Its demolition started in 2019 to make space for a new development. Others instead turned out to be successful, like the renovation of Fittja, an example of post-war social housing in Sweden. If you're interested in the topic of preservation linked to the program of housing, I suggest to research this project as it is a very interesting case. Demolition in the past was seen as the best way to regenerate so-called sink estates. This was a British term that came to describe council housing estates with a high level of social problems. Especially in politics, tearing down was often used as a promise for change and progress, events which instead often led to displacement or social segregation. Preservation today is a way of testing a more inclusive process of change. Large-scale regeneration tries to be replaced by small but more strategic changes, which involve a closer engagement with the existing context and community. An alternative, where design turns into a dialogue between architects, residents, local businesses, politicians, and organizations. We conclude this first part of the lecture by highlighting various ways in which architects work in the field of reuse and preservation. First of all, the mapping process, which is an essential way of engaging with existing architecture. In addition to traditional drawing, documentation today is also supported by technology such as 3D scanning and photogrammetry. This method enables to obtain accurate information about physical objects and the environment through the process of recording, measuring, and layering photographic images. Another important way is thinking about subtraction as a creative process. This is founded on the idea that acts of removal and models of degrowth can be planned with the same amount of precision and decision-making that is generally reserved for construction. In a way, subtraction could be taught in architecture schools as part of the training in building and preserving. Deconstruction can be seen as a form of design in itself, as shown by contemporary practices such as rotor. An example of inverted architecture, where a project begins with the careful planning of how to dismantle a building, in order to salvage its parts and make them available again in the market. So with this point, we conclude the first part of the lecture. We're moving on to the second part of this lecture. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will look at 3 case studies in detail. The first case opens a chapter titled Reframing History and looks at how reuse and preservation can help to reframe architectures of the past as contemporary and make them resistant to obsolescence, a word which in architecture is often used to describe when a building or architectural element becomes outdated and gradually starts losing its purpose. We will discuss this by looking at the Castelvecchio Museum by the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa. The building complex of the Castelvecchio Museum is located in Verona, along the banks of the river Adige. It was directly built on the old city walls, in a strategic location that made it one of the key defensive structures for the city throughout many centuries. The structure of the Castelvecchio can be said to have been shaped by the multiple construction phases throughout history. 3 key moments are highlighted in this slide and show, first, the structure as it stood in the 1800s before the open courtyard facing the river was closed by a new wing. Second, the heavy damages that were caused by World War II bombings and that heavily hit the city between 1940 and 43, which largely destroyed the eastern wing of the castle. Finally, its arrangement as it stands today after Scarpa's restoration. In order to understand the reasons behind Scarpa's project, it is important to look back at its previous restoration. During the 1920s, the historian Antonio Vena was commissioned the project of turning the fortress into a museum. He restored it according to what is described as pastiche, a technique which describes when an architecture style of the past is imitated. In Avena's case, he reconstructed frescoes and decorated rooms according to a medieval style. Scarpa criticized this fake representation of history and instead wished to bring back a sense of clarity in the architecture of the building. In 1957, Licisco Magagnato, the new director of the museum, appointed Scarpa as the new architect. At the beginning, the project only counted a renovation of the rooms by replacing the period with a more modern look. But as the works carried on, the project gradually extended to other areas of the castle. Scarpa took 18 years to complete his work, a period in which he developed the design to an incredible level of detail. His drawings are famous as they show the process of the architect being on site and talking to craftsmen and artisans who realized the ideas. The project became a sort of research for how to find a dynamic relationship between the old and the new. Within the complex history of the fortress, the interventions were thought as a way of testing a new approach of architectural restoration, one where the aim was not simply to return the building back to its original condition, but rather to reframe its history as a collection of layers, where Scarpa saw the possibility of adding a new one. The project began with a series of excavations that brought light to the archaeological discoveries of a Roman moat and ancient medieval gate. These events inspired Scarpa to continue transforming Castelvecchio through removal in order to expose its hidden historical layers. This project is considered one of the first ones that helped to define the practice of experimental preservation. Scarpa's approach in working with the existing involved exploring new materials and techniques. He showed a way in which architects could intervene in sensitive historical contexts by often taking quite daring moves. As shown in these photographs, when sections of the castle were entirely removed and transformed. One way to understand Scarpa's design strategy for the Castelvecchio is to look at the displays of the museum. The supports for the objects were independent elements of design in his project. Metal structures and colored plaster backdrops became elaborate ways of connecting to the object. His attention for reframing the historical becomes clear in the design of the stands. Scarpa's entire restoration can be argued as a scenography that helps to reframe the old building, adding a new layer while also maintaining a visible distance between past and present. Let's look now at how this design strategy continues to unfold throughout the museum. The images show the interiors before and after Scarpa's restoration. The interventions at an architectural scale can all be understood by observing how the existing is framed by the new. Support is not just understood at the level of the base supporting a sculpture, but as additional thicknesses, planes, surfaces, and structures surrounding the historical fabric of the building. Scarpa transforms functional elements such as floors, walls, and staircases into objects of contemplation through his obsession for the detail. His intervention sets up a contrast between these parts, with the new layer working both as backdrop and focal point in the existing context. The contrast between old and new can be noticed especially in the space of gaps or subtle changes in level, which highlight different periods. The word layer becomes a very important one in this project, a word that is commonly used to describe a geological process, the building up of sediment layers, also known as the process of stratification. Through his intervention, Scarpa could encourage an archaeological, almost geological reading of this building, displaying its historical fabric by putting it in contrast to the new. The level of the new intervention is always distinguished from the old and used as a way of contrasting the ancient structure of the fortress through the use of orthogonal geometry and modern materials. It can be noticed in the example of the geometrical glazed screens fitted behind the Gothic windows, or in the roof, where the extension is a laminated copper surface sliding out of the Roman tiles. This slide shows the most designed space of the project, which is known as the Can Grande space. As shown earlier, removals and excavations led to the discovery of a buried medieval doorway and Roman moat. By the time of the discovery, Scarpa faced the problem of a new level of ground and the meeting of elements around the excavations. This is when he proposed the entire demolition of this bay of the gallery. A sequence of interior and exterior demolitions which led to the opening of the Can Grande space, a gap where the history of the museum was exposed and framed by his design. It's clear how this project of preservation has helped to reframe the visitor's perception of the museum as a destination for admiring both the building's history and the architect's design. The project affects every space of the museum, from the corners of floors to the stairs to the detail of wall plugs. This quote by the architect Richard Murphy describes the new in the Castelvecchio as revealing itself as a series of planes or laminates, the progressive accretion of deposits in the manner of a sedimentary rock. The visitor is immersed into an experience that blurs the idea between building and object, to the point that it makes us question which of the two is the subject of display, revealing that at the end, this museum is about the collection of art as much as it is about its architecture. The next chapter of the lecture is titled Small Scale, Big Change, and explores how minimal moves of alteration can transform and extend the lives of buildings which are often considered worth demolition. The case study is the transformation of Tours Bois-les-Prêtres by the architecture firm Lacaton and Vassal. France, as other countries in Europe, has witnessed large-scale demolitions of housing blocks for decades. The architect's interest in looking for alternatives might have started after witnessing events such as the demolition of the massive Cité Lumineuse public housing project, which was built in Bordeaux during the 1960s. New policies in France at the beginning of the 2000s left behind the rehabilitation of districts and focused instead on intensive demolition, planning the reconstruction of nearly 200,000 units of housing in areas which were designated sensitive urban zones by the state. In response to these events, Lacaton Vassal and Frédéric Drouot, with the financial aid of the French Ministry of Culture and Communication, began a study of alternatives for the rehabilitation and expansion of towers in different regions of France. Its first line was never demolish, always add, transform, and use. This report looked at the way that housing could be improved by the enlarging of existing surface area of the individual units, the reorganization of circulation and access points, and the introduction of greater degrees of transparency. The tower was built in the early 60s along the Ring Road of Paris. This high-rise block of 16 stories includes 96 apartments. By the end of the 90s, the building was in a state of disrepair and failed to meet the building standards. As we have seen earlier in the introduction, modernist housing has long been the subject of criticism. They are usually criticized as anonymous and isolating, and in an effort to improve social problems, many have been torn down, as in the example of Robin Hood Gardens, which I showed earlier. Initial ideas proposed complete demolition. However, this would have displaced all of the residents who were social housing tenants. After debate on whether to demolish the building, in 2005, the architects finally won a government competition to transform the housing block. Lacaton and Vassal's project demonstrates that preservation, rather than rebuilding from scratch, can result in significant cost savings, and it is beneficial in allowing residents to stay in their apartments. I will now play a short clip of a documentary which captures the collaborative process behind this project.
ferait déjà plus joli. Ça vous donnerait un fond qui soit un fond théâtral.
Ça arrivera jusque-là. Parce que nous,
Quoi, jusque-là, quoi?
après, on mettra le frigo. Enfin,
Non, non, pas forcément, ça va pas être comme ça.
Je sais pas si vous voyez un peu les motifs, mais voilà. On aura. Ici, ce sera repoussé, je rentrerai par là. Chose que j'ai jamais fait. Donc on verra au moment. Moi, je sais que c'est vrai, voilà, c'est des choses qui vont changer. J'ai toujours venu ici, j'ai pris mon virage comme d'habitude, les yeux fermés. J'avais pas besoin de passer dans le salon ou quoi. Bon, maintenant, je rentrerai dans le salon.
Où est la porte d'ici? C'est pas une chambre là?
Non, la porte là, on va casser jusque là.
Ah, encore? Arrête! Quoi, parole?
Ils ont tout cassé.
Non!
Tu promets?
The following slides are a series of collages which describe the architect's concept for the transformation of the tower. Based on previous research and their interviews with building residents, Lacaton and Vassal focused on expanding spaces and increasing natural light to improve living conditions in each apartment. The first view shows the tower prior to renovations. As you might have guessed from the video, the project proposes an extension of the apartments. New floors built as a self-supporting structure were added on the periphery of the existing building at every floor to extend the living rooms, creating shuttered terraces and balconies. This add-on structure breaks up the monotony of the facade and provides new buffer zones. Winter gardens that help to improve aspects such as insulation, natural light, and floor area. With just an extension of 3 meters, this project managed to considerably improve the living conditions of each apartment. This is an existing plan of the tower. The architect's proposal was not motivated by the idea of preserving this building as a monument, but rather by challenging the potential for transformation and rehabilitation of the existing through simple alterations. This diagram shows the simple move of alteration, the 3-meter module that adds onto the facade of the building, extending the apartments and forming a new envelope for the tower. Photographs show the winter gardens and balconies modules being installed. Together with the 2 heated extensions on the northeast and southeast corners of the building, they were designed to be built on a structural frame which was independent of the existing building. Both the structure and the decision to prefabricate the platform units were motivated by the need for incremental construction, which would allow inhabitants to stay in the building by temporarily relocating to empty apartments while the work was being completed. An approach which shows how the residents were directly involved in the project. The additions to the tower connect to the existing slab lightly, becoming physically continuous from within, but remaining thermally and structurally separate. The project also involved the reorganization of the existing flats through the removal of partitions, making the interiors wheelchair accessible. In order to improve the circulation, 2 new lifts were added on both sides of the tower. Each of the winter gardens in the tower forms an intermediate space that feels like an enclosure compared to the outside balcony, but also an exterior space relative to the apartment. As such, the winter gardens help to give the units an additional degree of transformability, which they did not have before. The project succeeded also by improving the living conditions of communal areas. The ground floor and entrance hall were refurbished, providing new rooms for collective activities. 2 new lifts were added externally to improve the access to the apartments. The project applied materials usually used for building greenhouses, such as prefabricated concrete, steel decks, glass, metallic curtains, and translucent polycarbonate sheet. These are images that show how the extensions became occupied by the residents, some turning them into a living room, indoor garden, or dining area. When asked about their approach to social housing transformation and how it has greatly inspired other architects to adopt similar methods of working, Anne Lackaton states that it's encouraging to see that what we're doing attracts interest and is echoed abroad as well. We know that the interest comes chiefly from younger architects and schools, but what remains most difficult is convincing clients of the validity of our approach. Actually, even we only managed to do 3 projects in this particular way. It comes from our belief in what we find best about modernist architecture and housing. This includes free, open spaces, new relationships to the outside, and also structures that allow us to work towards appropriation and flexibility. What is the legacy of this project? At completion, it confirmed that rehabilitation and structural additions can be achieved for a third less than the cost of demolition and reconstruction. This not only represented a successful model that the architects could continue to use in different projects, but it also achieved to spread a bigger awareness. It calls for a different consciousness regarding the existing infrastructure of housing as a resource often overlooked within the city, one whose potential could be unlocked through light architectural moves capable of preserving while profoundly transforming. The project achieved to engage modestly but also radically on 2 different scales. On the one hand, that of the inhabitants, who appropriate and continue to transform their spaces that have been produced. On the other, seeking to influence public housing agencies and the policies shaping their actions. Considering the challenge of both scales, the existence of this project became a symbol of hope in a very uncertain territory. The last chapter is called Recycling the City and looks at the reclamation and reuse of derelict spaces in urban contexts. We will look at the Highline project by Diller and Scofidio. The Highline Viaduct was constructed in the 1930s to improve the viability of New York streets. It later lost its function and progressively became a derelict space in the heart of the city. The abandoned viaduct became the subject of a debate which lasted 3 decades and involved the topics of reuse and preservation of post-industrial heritage. First, let's quickly look at what industrial heritage means. With the development of the economy, new technologies emerge and many factories are made redundant and are forced to close their doors. These events often lead to questions such as what to do with these empty buildings and plants, what to do with the outdated machines, and how to deal with the abandoned spaces. One of the first countries that faced this transitional problem was the UK, where the search of reusing industrial areas started in the 1960s. In this slide you can see the famous Turbine Hall in the Tate Modern before it was turned into a museum. Some of the places were reserved and protected, such as this one, and the concept of industrial heritage came to the stage of history. Therefore, industrial heritage is a relatively new concept. Generally, it refers to industrial space, which includes buildings, equipment, and lands carrying the history and culture of the industrial production. Urban reclamation instead means reclaiming space in the city for public use again. The space is likely to have been used before and may consist of derelict or abandoned buildings, waste ground, or part-use space. This can often happen informally through temporary programs such as markets, concerts, or pop-up events. Essentially, to bring a derelict or disused area back to life is to reclaim it for community use. Going back to the High Line, here is a short history of this viaduct. In the 1800s, freight trains on street-level tracks delivered food to Lower Manhattan, but they created dangerous conditions for pedestrians. 10th Avenue became known as Death Avenue, as more than 540 people had been killed by trains. In response to the mounting deaths, the railroad hired men on horses to protect pedestrians. Until their final ride in 1941, the West Side Cowboys patrolled 10th Avenue, waving red flags to warn of oncoming trains. 1924 was the year when the West Side Improvement Project first began, and when the city's Transit Commission ordered the removal of street-level crossings. This later led to a plan to remove tracks from the streets and create an elevated rail line. In 1933, the first train ran on the High Line, which was then called the West Side Elevated Line. The line was fully operational by 1934, transporting millions of tons of meat, dairy, and products. The lines came to cut directly through some buildings, creating easy access for some factories. Between the 1960s and the 80s, train use decreased due to the rise of the use of trucks for the transportation of goods. The southernmost section of the High Line from Spring to Bank Streets was demolished in the 60s. The last train ran in the 1980s. Projects for reclaiming the High Line were made and abandoned several times. In 1991, 5 blocks of the structure were demolished. In 1999, instead, the High Line opened again to proposal for the structure's reuse. This plan shows the surviving sections of the viaduct, which today run between Chelsea and the West Village, and which at the time were left as a derelict space for many years. Throughout the decades of disuse, many people started to perceive the High Line as a negative presence and sign of degradation in the city. Giuliani, the mayor of New York for most of the 90s, together with his administration, were aware that the surviving portion of the High Line was a dead weight for an area, which at the time was growing into a neighborhood of galleries, restaurants, and lofts. In 2001, given the repeated failures at finding a suitable alternative for the structure, the mayor approved its demolition as one of the last things before leaving office. Part of what saved the High Line is that at some point its architecture seems to have acquired value as it was romanticized as a ruin. It is often said that a building that manages to enter this category somehow has managed to withstand or avoid the fate of demolition. Architecturally speaking, the process of decay has often proved to reawaken a general interest for a place, a process which follows an aesthetic fascination for decay. Much of the obsession for ruination is about the return of nature, the signs of patina and disorder. All these negative attributes, which John Ruskin calls injuries of time, are precisely what many lovers of ruins think as positive and valuable. Since I've mentioned John Ruskin's words, it is impossible to continue a talk on preservation without briefly mentioning his ideas in addressing ruins. John Ruskin is considered one of the most influential 19th century architectural writers. In The Seven Lamps of Architecture, he stated his principles on architecture. A book which is a bit old-fashioned but is still useful to know, as it is looked as an important reference in the areas of preservation and restoration. Ruskin strongly argued against the idea of restoration, as he saw it as a deceitful way of bringing a building back to its original condition. For him, memory should preserve our past perceptions and simultaneously allow us to face our state of mortality. For this reason, he defended the science of time and claimed that the greatest glory of a building is in its age. For Ruskin, ruins were seen as the noble and truthful expression of the passing of time. Back to the High Line, almost 20 years after the last train rode its track, two residents of the High Line neighborhood, Robert Hammond and Joshua David, both civic activists, finally saw its potential. By 1999, they had founded Friends of the High Line, a non-profit organization through which their plans started to take shape. The space had become a secret spot for some in the neighborhood. One of the founders claimed that the High Line's initial appeal had nothing to do with parks, and I quote, "It was the industrial ruin I was fascinated by, the steel and the rivets. To imagine a train running through my neighborhood was just so intriguing and exciting." So it is important to mention how the picturesque images of this secret landscape became instrumental in supporting the process of claiming its preservation and reuse. An aesthetic campaign which succeeded to frame the viaduct into a sort of monument of New York. This resulted in an increasing support from the public. In 2003, the organization held an ideas competition in order to find out what the New York community would have reused the High Line for. The proposals ranged from a 1.5-mile-long swimming pool, roller coaster, farm, and many others. The competition managed to mark a turning point in support for reusing the High Line as it reached out to public opinion. Finally, the project was awarded to the Office di Lorenzo Scofidio. The project was developed through a strategy of part agriculture, part architecture. The High Line surface was divided into units of paving and planting, which were assembled along the 1.5 miles into a variety of gradients, from 100% paving to 100% vegetation. The paving system consists of individual precast concrete planks with open joints, which encourage plants to grow spontaneously, like wild grass through cracks in the sidewalk. The long paving units were designed with tapered ends, which twist into planting beds, creating a textured landscape where the public can meander in different ways. The design managed to give form to a multitude of civic issues: reclamation of unclaimed public space, adaptive reuse of outmoded infrastructure, and preservation as a strategy for sustainability.
You know, we just thought, wow, you have 1.5 miles of Manhattan. Why rush to tear it down? Let's think about what else it can be. What else can you do with it?
Recycled from a defunct elevated railway, the High Line is a fantastic world of woodlands, thickets, prairies, and meadows, floating 30 feet in the air through 22 blocks of New York City. It is at once a monument to a bygone era and the centerpiece of a revitalized West Side.
The High Line is all about being in the city. It's an escape, but it's not an escape from the city. It's an escape from your normal experience of the city.
It's about reconnecting with the city from a completely new vantage point. So you're moving through the city in a new way and seeing the city in a new way.
You can see the Statue of Liberty looking one way, you can see the Empire State Building looking the other. It is a 1.5 mile long line That's a lot like a gallery in a museum, if you will, that allows you to experience the city in an extraordinary way, where the city is now the exhibit.
This is the end of the lecture, which I hope you have enjoyed and have found things that inspire you. Next week, there will be an introduction to your first assignment and session with Cathy Tong on research. I wish you a nice weekend.